What could drive Elvis Presley, the world's most adored icon, to explode in rage over something as innocent as a late-night conversation? Imagine Graceland under a veil of silence, where even the softest bond could spark a storm. In a home filled with luxury and loyalty, one moment shattered the calm, exposing a side of Elvis rarely seen. Not the charming showman, but a man gripped by jealousy, control, and fear of losing what he held closest. This wasn't just about rules, it was about power, possession, and the one night it all cracked. When Priscilla first arrived at Graceland, she was just a teenager swept into what felt like a dream. The gates opened, and with them came the promise of glamour, love, and a life lived beside one of the most famous men in the world. Everything was larger than life. The house, the cars, the aura of fame that surrounded Elvis. And in those first days, it was easy to be dazzled. She had left behind the world she knew, stepping into one where she believed she'd be cherished and celebrated. But it didn't take long for that dream to dim at the edges. Graceland, for all its size, was a quiet and lonely place when Elvis wasn't home. He was often gone for weeks at a time, filming movies, performing, being Elvis Presley to the rest of the world. Inside those walls, however, Priscilla found herself increasingly isolated. She wasn't allowed to invite friends or make her own plans. Everything she did, everything she said, everything she wore, it all existed in service to his world. The mansion that had seemed so magical now felt more like a beautifully gilded cage, one where the rules weren't written, but were always strictly enforced. What became clear over time was that she wasn't just Elvis's girlfriend. She was an extension of his carefully maintained image. Her identity, her voice, even her personal connections were filtered through the lens of what fit into his version of reality. Being close to Elvis didn't mean having freedom. It meant being constantly watched, subtly shaped, and emotionally groomed to play a role that left little room for her own desires. And when she began to find even the smallest cracks in that system, moments of warmth with someone her own age, that illusion of control began to splinter. Among the rotating cast of characters that drifted through the halls of Graceland, Jerry Schilling stood out. Not just to Elvis, but to someone quietly craving connection. Jerry wasn't a distant older figure or another staff member lost in the shadow of the king. He was young, warm, approachable, close enough in age and energy to speak the same unspoken language as Priscilla. While he was part of Elvis's trusted circle, he never carried himself with the same hardened detachment. There was something sincere about Jerry, something that didn't feel like it belonged to the world of celebrity and control. Their conversations were never planned, never dramatic. They happened in passing, small exchanges at the kitchen counter, quiet moments in between the noise of life at Graceland. It wasn't romance, it wasn't rebellion, it was something far more radical in that house, a normal, human interaction. Jerry listened, he asked questions, and in a world where everything was filtered through Elvis' moods and expectations, just being heard without judgment felt like a rare kind of freedom. For Priscilla, this was more than a friendship. It was a glimpse of something she hadn't realized she was starving for. Recognition beyond her role as Elvis' companion. Jerry saw her not as a fixture of someone else's story, but as a person with thoughts, feelings, and frustrations of her own. That simple connection, in a home teeming with people yet soaked in silence, was a quiet rebellion. And though it seemed harmless at the time, it would not go unnoticed for long. It was late, one of those quiet Graceland nights when the house seemed to exhale after a long day, wrapped in stillness and dim hallway lights. Most of the staff had settled down, and the tension of being constantly observed had loosened just enough for a few private words to be exchanged without fear. In one of those hushed corners of the mansion, Priscilla found herself in an easy conversation with Jerry. There was no plotting, no secrecy, just two people sharing a laugh, connecting over the little things that helped pass the long, lonely hours. But unknown to them, a shadow was watching, and that shadow did not take kindly to what he saw. The air seemed to crack when Elvis entered the room. Gone was the charming performer, replaced by a man whose voice cut through the calm like a blade. Without a second of hesitation, he turned to Priscilla, anger flaring in his eyes. "Scylla, you don't need to be roaming around here late at night," he snapped, the warmth drained from his voice. He didn't wait for a reply. He ordered her upstairs, a command, not a request, echoing off the walls. Behind her, she could hear his fury shift toward Jerry. The calm, respectful tone he once used with his friend was replaced by something cold and sharp, a warning cloaked in rage. "If you want to keep this job, son, you mind your own business," Elvis barked, his voice rising with each word. "If there's anyone who's going to ask her how she feels, it'll be me. You better mind your own goddamn business." Those words, delivered like a verdict, hung in the air, heavy and final. In that moment, a line had been drawn. What began as an innocent exchange became a spark that ignited something deeper, something darker. And in the silence that followed, everyone understood that Graceland had rules, unspoken ones, and crossing them came at a cost. After that night, something unspoken but irreversible settled between Priscilla and Jerry. There were no angry words between them, no follow-up conversation or attempt at closure, just a quiet, mutual retreat. They didn't lock eyes in the hallway anymore, didn't exchange polite greetings in passing. Whatever warmth had once existed was frozen by a single outburst. The message had been made crystal clear. Even the suggestion of closeness with anyone outside the bubble Elvis controlled was off limits. And in a house where words traveled fast and moods ruled the air, silence became their only safety. Elvis, for all his charisma and generosity, had a way of masking control with concern. His jealousy was wrapped in the language of protection, his commands disguised as care. He didn't have to forbid. A glare, a tone, a single sentence was enough to rewire the atmosphere. Priscilla, still so young, was left constantly second-guessing what was allowed, who she could trust, and what version of herself was acceptable in his orbit. The emotional boundaries weren't built with locked doors or harsh punishments. They were built with fear of disappointing him, of losing the version of love he dangled so delicately in front of her. This wasn't an isolated outburst. It was part of a larger pattern that pulsed through their entire relationship. Moments of connection with others, no matter how innocent, were seen as threats, and any independence was swiftly corrected. Over time, it conditioned Priscilla to retreat further into herself, to depend entirely on Elvis, not just for affection, but for identity. What seemed like a single argument was, in truth, a reflection of something deeper. A love story shaped not only by passion and fame, but by the quiet erosion of personal freedom. Beneath Elvis' fiery reaction that night was something far more complicated than a fleeting moment of jealousy. At the heart of it all was his obsession with loyalty, an expectation that bordered on sacred. He demanded it, revered it, clung to it like a lifeline in the chaos of his fame. For the women in his life, especially Priscilla, fidelity wasn't just a romantic virtue, it was a rule, an oath, a condition of being close to him. Any perceived threat to that devotion, even a harmless conversation, could trigger a storm. To Elvis, loyalty wasn't just about love, it was about control, and any shift in that balance threatened the very identity he built around himself. But behind this rigid demand was a contradiction so sharp it stung. While Priscilla was expected to remain faithful, emotionally, physically, and even socially, Elvis was far less disciplined with his own actions. Priscilla would later admit that, even in the early days, she had her suspicions. The lingering glances he gave other women, the flirtations that played out in front of her, the unspoken rumors that floated through the walls of Graceland, these were not the habits of a man holding himself to the same standard he enforced. And yet he never wavered in his expectation that she remain unwaveringly his. This double standard didn't just strain their relationship, it made moments like the confrontation with Jerry feel unbearably loaded. It wasn't just about that night, it was about every unspoken rule, every instance where Priscilla had to dim her voice to keep the peace. The weight of the hypocrisy made the emotional blow even heavier. In the end, the real battle wasn't about friendship or flirtation. It was about a man fighting to preserve the illusion of loyalty in a world where his own actions had already cracked it. Working for Elvis wasn't like working for anyone else. It was stepping into a world where the lines between loyalty and servitude blurred, where time itself revolved around one man's needs. His inner circle, known famously as the Memphis Mafia, lived in a state of constant readiness. There were no schedules, no breaks, no off switches. If Elvis wanted to talk at 3 a.m., someone had better be listening. If he felt like going for a spontaneous drive, the cars were expected to be ready, engines humming. The demands didn't always make sense, and they didn't have to. The job wasn't about logic, it was about presence, availability, and total submission to the moment, no matter how unreasonable it seemed. Priscilla, though not an employee in the traditional sense, felt the weight of this dynamic in deeply personal ways. In her own reflections, she makes it clear, this wasn't just a love story, it was an ongoing performance. Every expression, every choice, every silence was filtered through the question of what Elvis would think or feel. Her life became one of quiet sacrifices, of molding herself into the version of his girl that would keep him happy and calm. Love in this world wasn't just about emotion, it was about adaptability, about making yourself small enough to fit into someone else's larger-than-life story. And for Priscilla, that role became both her identity and her cage. We often think of Elvis Presley as a legend, untouchable, adored, and larger than life. But what happens when we look beyond the spotlight and question the stories we've accepted as part of his charm? Was his intense attachment to those he loved a sign of passion, or a symptom of something far more troubling? The man who sang about love with such soul-stirring power also built invisible walls around the people closest to him. And as we revisit this one particular moment, it challenges us to reconsider. Was his grip on Priscilla a form of protection or possession? Inside the gates of Graceland, the world didn't operate by ordinary rules. Every smile was noticed, every conversation had weight, and even the smallest gesture could be misunderstood. In a house where a kind word between two people could unleash a firestorm, the pressure was relentless. The cost of being loved by someone so adored by the world was losing the space to breathe in your own skin. The grand estate, for all its beauty and comfort, held a kind of silence that only those inside its walls truly understood. A silence born of fear, of restraint, of walking on emotional eggshells. And so we're left with a question that lingers long after the anger fades. Was Elvis truly afraid of losing Priscilla, the young woman who had given up everything for him? Or was it the idea of losing control that unsettled him most? The answer, perhaps, lives somewhere in the space between love and fear, where devotion becomes demand and affection begins to look a lot like confinement. If this glimpse behind the curtain made you see things in a new light, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps us share these hidden stories with more people. Subscribe to the channel for more untold moments, rare insights, and emotional truths from the lives of icons we thought we knew. And most importantly, we want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think this was love, control, or something more complicated? Let's talk about it.